to take this time. I'd like to take this time to introduce our speaker for today. The topic is Revolutionary Battles on Mobile Bay. The Gulf Coast played a pivotal role in the American Revolution. Historian Mike Bunn will kick off our America 250 Years with a presentation on the battles at Mobile and the Village. Mike currently serves as Director of Historic Blakeley State Park in Spanish Fort, Alabama. He is the author or co-author of several books on Gulf South history, focusing on the colonial, early statehood, antebellum, and Civil War periods, some of which are on the table up front. So please take an opportunity to come look through them. He is the winner of the NSDAR Excellence in American History Award for 14th Colony, the forgotten story of the Gulf South during the Revolutionary era. So with that, please welcome Mr. Mike Bunn.
Morning, everybody.
Morning.
I have spoken here before. I don't know what I spoke about. So some of you I recognize, some of you I know from other places. I've spoken in Pensacola. So I would imagine that some of you may have heard me give at least part of this presentation about 14th Colony, because the presentation day is based on a part of that book. So we're going to talk a little bit about the colony of West Florida as an introduction, the Revolutionary War era colony of West Florida, and then we'll get into more specifics than I usually have about the military campaigns that involve Mobile Bay and Pensacola. I've been asked to do this a few times with the 250th. I heard you talk about plans for 250th, so that's come up, and a lot of groups I've spoken to have asked me to come back and focus on a little bit of a military sort of topic in it. So that's what this is about. And I prepared this for some other organizations. And so here we are, had opportunity to come here. And I said, yeah, I happen to have a presentation that's ready to go. So what I'll do today, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about the colony, where we're at, what it was a part of, as a refresher, how it got there, a little bit of context. And then we'll talk about the military campaigns that specifically affected this area. And hopefully help you understand a little bit better a forgotten chapter in local history, and I think it's a really important chapter. So this is West Florida, its original boundaries. And I'll stress the word original because it ultimately changed slightly, and we'll talk about that. I jokingly have always called it the 14th Colony. That's the name of my book. And people ask, well, you know, why was it the 14th and not the 15th or the 16th? Because there were more than 13 colonies in continental U.S. At the time of the American Revolution, and 13 chose to rebel. And so the sort of joking answer to that, which is half true, is that it's not a sequential order of establishment. It doesn't mean there's literally the 14th colony established. It just means there's more to the story. There's something extra. And even more pointedly, there's a nice gentleman who I know, and I helped review his book about East Florida. And his came out a few years after mine. So I get to say West Florida is the 14th colony because they were established at the same time. So West Florida, East Florida were established at the exact same time, right after the 7 Years' War. And that's a war that's international conflict between France, Great Britain, and our allies, and it was fought all over the globe, was not fought here, but the consequences led to the establishment of this colony, because France, you see a before and after maps on the screen, what North America looked like with colonial holdings, European colonial holdings before and after the war. Before is on the left, and you see France, and that huge swath of land they owned, and they had established Mobile and ultimately New Orleans and other places, had this huge holding, and France lost the war. So Great Britain assumes ownership of quite a bit of land. France is eliminated as a power, North America at the time, and you see the map on the right, you don't see that French holding, but you see that Great Britain has enormously expanded their holdings, and you see that Spain has had some growth and some losses in there. They actually lost part of Florida and was given to Great Britain. So there's a whole lot of stories about what that means in American history that we don't have time to get into. But the one big one is that France is gone, Great Britain has grown, and where we're sitting today, this was suddenly for the first time all British territory, and they immediately created two new colonies out of it. West Florida, which I showed you the map of, and we got another map of it. You see outlined there with the green outline, and then basically the Florida Peninsula is East Florida. So those are the two new colonies they created, West and East Florida. A lot of times I get this presentation and I'll mention in West Florida, and I'll be talking to a group in Mississippi or New Orleans, and they're like, I didn't know this was about Panama City. Well, it's not. That's just the name of the colony. So West Florida's original borders are shown on this map. That's 1763. Very next year, they moved the border up. The people on the ground said, look, there's no competing European power. The best agricultural land is just to the north. It's not on the coast. All these rivers drain into the Gulf, and we'd like to take advantage of that. And so they asked for permission to expand the colony all the way up to basically what is now the Tennessee state line. And London said no, but they agreed to meet them halfway. They said, look, your arguments make sense. We'll expand it north to this easy to find geographic waypoint that you could find before GPS. It's really easy to find. It's at the 32 degrees, 28 minutes on the Mississippi River. Does anybody have any idea what that might be? Everybody been to Vicksburg, Mississippi? Huge hills, huge bluffs. Yazoo River enters the Mississippi. You're coming along the Mississippi. You've got a lot of Mississippi Delta. Then this huge mountain of series of hills there. That is where they decided that line would be. It was easy to find border, and they said the border will just be moved up to the 32nd degree, 28 minutes, and run east to the Chattahoochee River. So if you look at that map, when they expanded the colony in 1764, you're talking about a boundary that goes through what is today Vicksburg, Jackson, Mississippi, Montgomery, Alabama, on to roughly Columbus, Georgia. So you're talking about half of what is now Alabama and Mississippi, and a portion of what is now Louisiana, and where we are in Florida. So that is the colony in its fullest extent. And that's why I think the story that we'll talk about today is really important to us, because it is our local connection to the Revolutionary War. It's a connection a lot of people don't realize really even happened. So just a few quick things about the founding of the colony. I get into a lot more of this in my other presentations, but you got to understand that when Britain took over this area, they assumed that they were going to be stepping in, raising a flag, and taking over an established place. You know, Mobile and Pensacola had been on maps of the Southeast for, 75 years or at least 65 years by that time. When they got there, they realized that they were really going to have to create a colony from scratch. Mobile and Pensacola were both very small villages that were living and dying by their association with the military outposts that were there. They were struggling villages. They were not in the orbit of any major trade routes. They were not experiencing a lot of immigration. And the British stepped ashore and realized not only that, but most of the guys they're sending to occupy these new posts, and Pensacola and Mobile would remain the major communities throughout the entire period. Most of the guys they're sending are coming from other places with a radically different climate. And we think of today being this is a wonderful place to live. It's nice and moderate climate. But for them, when they first stepped ashore in the middle of a very hot fall and hurricane season, not exactly the best experience. And they actually, farmer in Mobile called it the most disagreeable and unhealthy place in all of America. He said it's good for nothing but as a graveyard for British people, because they stepped ashore and they were acclimated to the climate. And by the first fall, over half of the guys they had sent out to man these new outposts were either sick or dead. It was a really rough start in both places, Mobile and Pensacola. Frederick Haldeman, who was sent here, said he couldn't find anything good to say about Pensacola, except that he had a nice sea breeze that he could enjoy every once in a while. But he had to spend most of his time inside the fort doing work, so he couldn't get to enjoy it. And he wrote to his wife, he said, one summer here in this place will make you yearn for the ice of Canada. So please get me out of here. So it's a rough start. And I say all that to let you know how remarkable it is that they made the efforts that they did. So they started in this bad situation and they went about working very diligently to create a new colony, functioning colony. This is the territorial or the provincial seal of the colony of West Florida. It established a functioning government headquartered here in Pensacola. It was the first elected representative bicameral legislature in Gulf Coast history. I mean, this is the first time you had elected representatives. They had appointed councilors, which formed the upper house, and then you had representatives elected from the various population centers. And it's a pretty remarkable occurrence, even though the legislature did not function the way you may assume. They didn't meet every year. They met when the governor called them into session. And he did that 7 times within some 7 or 18 years. So that is one of a host of reasons why we don't know as much about West Florida, I think, as we might with other places. You just didn't have that steady interaction of the public with elected officials the way you do in some other places. You might have had this thing continued on. But anyway, Capitol was stationed at Pensacola. It stayed at Pensacola the whole time it was under British possession, much to the chagrin of the people in Mobile, who were at first told that they might hold some sessions of the legislature in Mobile. Mobile was at least as large, if not larger, than Pensacola, nearby. And they had a good bit of fighting about that, but no sessions of the legislature were ever held at Mobile. Everyone was held at Pensacola. And the thing that they were most concerned about in a lot of those legislative sessions may not be something that immediately comes to mind as a pressing need in colonial times, but it was not necessarily how to get along or disagree with Spain or other colonies. It was how to get along with Native Americans. And what they were doing is what's depicted on the screen, is they were involved at a time period in which the trade between Native communities and Europeans was sort of at its height. This was a mutually beneficial trade. This was something that both sides were getting a lot of advantage out of at this particular moment in time. That would change in years to come. But I always highlight the fact that, at any given point in West Florida, the colony of West Florida's history, you had a European population of maybe 2,500, 5,000 people. It's not a lot of people. At any given point in that same timeline, the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, neighboring tribes would have easily numbered 75,000 or more. So had they not wanted this small British outpost in their territory, they certainly could have done something about it, but they did not. They had already ceded land on the coast to European nations, and they thought it would be pretty advantageous. I'm summarizing a lot of views here, but in general, it was pretty advantageous to have such a well-supplied trading partner to do business with. Britain had access to the best and the most of everything. And what you see here are them enjoying that. They had access to metal tools and pots and hoes and axes, firearms, spices, fabrics. What they had to purchase that with was something they had in abundance at the time, which was deer skins. They would ship hundreds of thousands of deer skins to Europe every year to transform them into everything that you would basically use leather for, book bindings to breeches. And this was something that for both sides worked very well for a while. Now, it's not one hunter going out and finding a deer and trying to trade. It's entire villages, the men of the village going out, staying out for months, burning sections of the woods, industrial scale farming. But for the moment that West Florida was existing, that activity was at its height. There were plenty of deer still. There would not be soon. And there was a market for this stuff. There would not be soon. But that's that moment in time in which this was a major concern, how to regulate that trade and best benefit from that trade. Now, most of the people who are coming to settle in the colony are coming to engage in agriculture. They're trying to make a living off the land. Some are bringing slaves or purchasing African slaves from Their neighbors in Louisiana, owned by Spain. We'll talk about that in a bit. They're growing everything that you might assume and some that you might not. Corn was, of course, a big staple, rice, and chickpeas of all things. A lot of chickpeas grown in this area. Stuff you make hummus out of was very popular. They're herding cattle and hogs. That's where all the industry in that industrial scale activity in that really started in the South in that era. They're trying to grow tobacco, which is a very lucrative crop. That they're more and better tobacco being grown in other parts of the British Empire, but they tried their hand at it to some limited success here on the Gulf Coast. They tried their hand at indigo production, which is very difficult but very lucrative. Multi-step process, takes a lot of wherewithal. And some people got really wealthy on it. A lot of people did not. You know what indigo, what I'm talking about, it's the dye that you get from the plant. And what you see on the top is the way they would, after they process it into this powder, they would form it into cakes, and that's what is shipped across the globe. The thing that really made the economy go is a combination of all that and the timber industry. Taking advantage of the enormous swaths of longleaf pine we had on the Gulf Coast, most of which are gone. And all the other types of timber, especially for naval purposes. They love these longleaf pine for ship mast, long, tall, straight, dense, what we a lot of times today call heart pine. It's really just longleaf pine, and we don't have much of it. And they loved some of the live oak for those curving pieces and the trunks that you could use for ship keels, et cetera. So that when you put all that together, you really have a hodgepodge of a agricultural economy that's beginning to take shape. And this is a map just north of Mobile, Tensas Delta. You see the winding rivers, you see all those rectangles. All those rectangles are where land concessions were being developed. So not all of these mean there's people living on those, but that means there are people that are either sending hired or enslaved labor to clear it out. Some actually have homes, but you get the idea. That one little section of the colony just north of Mobile, you can see the idea of an agricultural economy is taking shape, and West Florida is beginning to develop slowly like the British wanted. Some of the best land in the territory was, of course, not here where we are. The best agricultural land that they had anywhere in the colony was near the Mississippi, over near Natchez district. So a lot of the people that would come would arrive at Pensacola and Mobile, and then they would go out to claim land holdings where the agricultural regions are. So it's a very rural colony with two cities that have a lot of people going through them, but not a lot are staying. The cities, Mobile and Pensacola, remain about the same size, even though the colony's population grows throughout the period. The one best thing I use to always illustrate how serious the British were to developing the colony is the fact that their neighbors to the west, in Louisiana, the Spanish, had the mouth of that river, the Mississippi, go through their territory. And that's why New Orleans is what it is. Well, they dreamed up a scheme where they had hoped to divert some of that traffic on that international waterway and send it through West Florida. They actually tried to dig a canal that would divert some of the water of the Mississippi into West Florida. So you have a new trading entrepot and major towns established on this new waterway. So they tried to dig this thing on what is now the Iberville River. I don't know if anybody familiar with that area near Baton Rouge? It's basically a big ditch. It's a swampy, wet ditch, and it's like that most of the year, and then the rains come, and for a little while, a month or two a year, you can get a ship down it. Well, they tried to make that into a canal, and the way that would work is to go into Lake Maurepas, onto Lake Pontchartrain, etc. Needless to say, it doesn't flow that way today. It didn't work, but they sunk a lot of effort, time, and materials into doing that. So that's just sort of a good illustration of that. This was not a colony they just simply let struggle. They were investing resources. They had a lobbyist who was stationed permanently in London. So they were constantly in the ear of British colonial officials trying to develop this thing. So all that effort resulted in a very slow pace of growth. So 1765, you see non-Indian population is more than doubled by 1775, but that's a pretty slow pace of growth. And then something called the American Revolution happened, which is going to just totally turn upside down everything that had happened and ultimately lead to the colony actually being a change of hands of ownership of the colony. So everybody is familiar to some degree with this map. You may not know exactly where Ticonderoga was, but you all know that in general, American Revolution was fought north and east of where we're at. And in most maps of Revolutionary War America, you don't even see this area depicted, much less show battles that occurred here. But it was a significant theater. It wasn't necessarily between the Americans and the British, but it was between the Spanish and the British for the most part. And it did affect the course of the revolution. So that's what we'll get into the remainder of our presentation. And this map I love to show because it's one of those many. I got it out of a college textbook, and it doesn't, you wouldn't even know, it's got the wrong borders. It's got no communities of any size, and it's got no battles. And I just think it's a perfect depiction of how little we know about this area and why it's sort of a discovery to find out about it. So the first question most people ask when I get to start talking about the military campaigns is, why was West Florida not part of this revolutionary movement? Why were there 13 colonies and not 14, 15, or whatever number? Well, they were invited to participate in the Continental Congress, not once, but twice, and they politely declined. But they did not decline because they were just raging loyalists, proud of the British Empire, anything like that. You got to put yourself in their shoes and realize their situation. They are thousands of miles away from any other major center of power. They have no regular trade or communication with the other British colonies. Brand new colony. It's only a decade or so old when the revolution breaks out. You got more military soldiers and officers here than you have, almost more than you got new immigrants. And they saw this. They heard what was happening bits and pieces in places like Boston. And I always use this phrase. It's a little bit of exaggeration, but they kind of thought of it as somebody else's business. It's a local concern. It does not concern us. The things that they're talking about in other places were not directly concerning them on the streets in Pensacola or in the farms on the Mississippi River. They kind of thought the whole thing would blow over. They'd figure out a solution, and they would go on trying to figure out how to develop their colony. And so their reluctance to get involved was not this political ideological stance necessarily. It's just a practical one. And so that is going to be the stance that the colony takes in the revolution, is they don't really want to get involved, but they'll ultimately become involved in some way. Now, there was a little bit of discussion of things like the Stamp Act that affected everybody's pocketbook. And in the porch, you might hear a little grumbling about it, but there's not a single instance of anything I've ever found that approaches anything like a Sons of Liberty group or any sort of organization that's either dedicated to American ideals or British rights. These are people that basically hear what's going on hundreds and thousands of miles away and said they'll sort it out eventually. It's not something that's immediate concern for them. The British leadership here actually assumed that because that was the situation, that the people here were not going to get involved, but should the United States ever make any effort to do anything on the Gulf Coast or Spain, that they said, we don't need to have huge garrisons here. If we were threatened, the people here would rise up and help us defend it. Well, they hoping were threatened, and they did not help them rise up and defend it, as we'll see. So they said, this is a great quote by General John Campbell, said the people here are generally self-interested and without public spirit. So these are people not ideologically motivated for the most part. There's a few exceptions, but in general, this is a group of people who are just trying to go about their business of establishing a colony. By way of example, everybody knows a little bit about Revolutionary War history. What is the youngest of the 13 colonies that participated in the American Revolution? The one that was founded closest to the time of the war. Anybody know? Got a guess? Georgia, founded 1730s. That's the youngest. The oldest were founded much earlier than that in the 1600s. So my point is that by the time of the American Revolution in the 1770s, even the youngest of the other colonies had nearly a half a century to develop towns, infrastructure, newspapers, government, all kinds of other infrastructure. This colony was brand new was just over a decade old and was just getting its feet on the ground as far as organizing its government, establishing how it was even going to bring people here. So when this thing hit, you can understand these people were not necessarily tied strongly to any political ideology. Now, the war is ultimately going to find the colony in two ways. We'll focus most of my remaining time on the big campaign between the Spanish and the British, but I do want to mention there was actually some interaction with an American force and a British force. We're really not even British forces, but between American raiding forces, I should say, and the British in West Florida. Has anybody heard of the Willing campaign? Know anything about it? It's a whole chapter in my book. I won't go into much detail with it, except it's just an interesting story. James Willing had lived in Natchez. He was from Pennsylvania. He had connections with folks who were in the Continental Congress. He knew that there was great interest among the American government of expanding the war in some way to include the Gulf South. People looked on the maps and said, boy, if we win this war, it would be great if we could not only control the Atlantic coast, but those little bitty outposts down there in the Floridas, they're not really participating. Wouldn't be great if we could control, the mouths of all those rivers leading to the Gulf. Now, the problem was no one had the resources to do it. Actually, when it was raised in Continental Congress, you can read the debates a time or two. The representatives from places like South Carolina and North Carolina would stand up and say, well, why are we even talking about this? Why don't you devote your sources to the colonies actually fighting this rebellion right here? They were always strapped for resources, so it never really got off the ground. But Willing came up with the idea that, he could make a name for himself, and I don't know what his ultimate goals were besides a campaign of plunder, but he said, if you just give me a few men and a ship, I'll go down there and I'll make sure West Florida stays out of the rebellion, out of the Revolutionary War. I'll make sure that all the supplies that the Spanish want to send to George Washington because they hate the British, all that will happen if you just let me go down there. Problem was they were already sending supplies to George Washington. Oliver Pollock in New Orleans was the second largest financier of the American Revolution. So clearly supplies were being sent through this area to Washington. So that wasn't needed. West Florida, he said, we keep them neutral. Well, as I just discussed, they were going to stay neutral. So this was not really a serious expedition, but he was given 50 men. He was given a ship and a commission. The ship it's a funny thing to think that he's going to launch an expedition with this thing. It was literally named the Rattle Trap. And he goes down down the Mississippi, and he basically conducts a campaign of plunder. He basically stops in the shores of West Florida at Natchez, puts an American flag up, says, you guys stay out of the war and you'll be okay. And then he promptly goes and raids every plantation in the area on his way to New Orleans, where he assumes that he can sell all of these things that he's got in New Orleans because he knows Louisiana and the Spanish are not aligned with the British. So this happens, and it's an interesting little interlude in the war, but the connection to the larger campaign is it brings into view for the first time the new governor of Louisiana, owned by the Spanish, Mr. Galvez, Bernardo de Galvez, a name that a lot of people know around here. And he marks an abrupt change in what Spain and Spanish were doing in Louisiana. Prior to him getting there, the British and the Spanish were not friends, but on the frontier, they kind of looked the other way. So that a lot of the trading was going on was illegal, but the British were actively seeking to trade with the Spanish, even though they were officially forbidden to, and the Spanish were letting them because they were officially forbidden to, but they made good trading partners on the isolated frontier. So much so that the British actually stationed ships and were allowed to keep ships in the Mississippi at the port of New Orleans trading. This was all officially forbidden. When Galvez got into office, though, he said, we're going to follow the law and do exactly what my home government says. He was well connected with Spanish authorities. His father had been a pretty high-ranking official. So it was a pretty quick change. And it let the British in West Florida know that for the first time, that Spain actually might be an enemy. At first, they had this cozy relationship with Louisiana. Galvez gets in, and it's immediately apparent that might not last. and that they might actually have a threat from the West. Before, they'd always thought maybe America might get interested in coming down here, but no, it's going to be the Spanish. And that's the campaigns that we'll talk about. So Galvez got into office. He knew his home government was considering joining the American war effort in some way. Everybody's familiar with France being an ally of the United States in the American Revolution. What a lot of people forget is that France was begging and pleading and pulling with Spain to come join it. It did not want to be the only European power helping the United States. They were still a little bit scared of Great Britain. But Spain was very reluctant to get involved because Spain still had colonies, just like the British had colonies. And Spain said, this is a pretty bad precedent to take with us trying to own these colonies to do the exact thing that we don't want to have done. So they wrestled with it and they ultimately decided to declare war against Great Britain, but not officially assist the United States. But the effect was the same. If you fight Great Britain and Great Britain is distracted by a war with the United States, you're assisting the United States. And they knew this. But Galvez knew his home country was about to do that. And rather than waiting passively to see what would happen, he actively planned for a proactive strike against the neighboring British colony of West Florida. So that when war was declared in the summer of 1778, he wasn't caught off guard. He was actively ready to take the first step and take the fight to West Florida. British government here in West Florida was not so proactive. They talked big, but they didn't really make any plans. So war is declared. Galvez immediately takes his army that he's already raising, takes it north up the Mississippi River. There's a little outpost at the southern edge, southwestern edge of the colony of West Florida. That in yellow, that's West Florida. White is Spanish Louisiana. But they attack this place and capture it, Fort Butte. Then they go up to marching through the swamps. There's a great painting of Galvez and his troops there making their way through some lowlands. They go up to Baton Rouge, which was a formidable British outpost on the Mississippi, and they lay siege to it. And they, by some distraction, they make the British think that they're going to attack from one direction. They're making all this noise, but they're actually attacking from another direction. They catch them off guard. They capture the place, and then they force the commander at Baton Rouge to throw in the surrender of the fort at Natchez, even though there's no Spanish fort at Natchez, no British forces at Natchez, but he's forced to agree to the surrender of this. So in this whirlwind campaign, while the British government back here in Pensacola is wondering what to do now that Spain has declared war, Galvez has already conducted a campaign that's captured every major defensive post on the western edge of the colony. And he's back in New Orleans planning for what to do next. So this is the definition of a offensive by one of the belligerents that's just going to totally catch the British off guard. Now, his next campaign, as soon as that's over, and the government of Pensacola is wondering what to do, how do we raise forces? You know, most of their troops that were here had been required in other theaters of the Revolutionary War, so they managed to keep a small garrison or garrisons in this area. A lot of the troops had been already sent other places, sent to New York and other places. So they were really caught flat-footed in this, and they're asking their home government what to do. Galvez is already actively raising another army in New Orleans. And you can see on the screens, pretty diverse army. You've got regular troops and militia, free black militia, got some slave laborers who were they're not only laborers, some were actually armed, and actually a few Americans who volunteered for this. So it's a real hodgepodge force, but it's a formidable one. And he is going to, now that he's captured all these places on the Mississippi, he's looking at going over to Mobile. Now, why Mobile? So look at the geography here. Between, you see Lake Pontchartrain, New Orleans, and you know the entire Mississippi Gulf Coast was part of this colony of West Florida. But at the time, there really no major population center of any size whatsoever between New Orleans and Mobile Bay. You got a few small, there's a house, there's Krebs houses down there, there's a little village or two, but there's really no anything like what we'd call a city, a town, anywhere on that Gulf Coast at the time, no population center. So he moves ahead and is going to target Mobile because that's not only the next population center and the next major port from all the rivers that drain into the bay, But if he captures Mobile, he's effectively captured 2/3 of the colony before the British even put a force in the field. And so that's why he moves towards Mobile. And what we know is the battle for Mobile, they actually call it the Battle of Fort Charlotte, because that is the major fortification that's in town. So this is a period image of the town of Mobile looked like at the time. Not exactly huge. You see the heart of downtown. Has anybody been to Fort Condé? Know what I'm talking about? So this fortification that you see in the center, the reconstruction of Fort Condé embraces one of those, about a quarter to a third of the size of the original fort. That is what's going to be the focal point of this campaign. So Galvez's army makes its way out into the Gulf, and they're going to come into Mobile Bay. They encounter, because of the time of the year, they encounter some rough storms, blows the fleet, scatters the fleet, but they manage to get everything back together, make their way into Mobile Bay. And as soon as they get into Mobile Bay, there's a narrow channel there, and there's some treacherous shoal water. And they immediately found a British ship that had been stranded there. So they go up and they want to capture this, and they get their own ship stranded on the shoal. And so they sit there for a few days trying to figure out ways to get this ship off of this stranded position. Ultimately, Galvez says we're wasting too much time. We need to go ahead on towards Mobile, and they take what they can out of this stranded ship, and they create a small battery at the mouth of the bay. And this is on the right, you see Mobile Point, and you might be able to see Fort Morgan. This is where, Battle of Mobile Bay, the dam, the torpedoes, all that happened. So a few generations before that, though, the first fortification on that post was this makeshift artillery position put up by the Spanish. So that was the first fortification there. During the War of 1812, there'd be another American fortification. And then, of course, in the Civil War, there's one. So when you go to Fort Morgan, you're at a site that's been occupied successively. So it's just an interesting point that the Spanish were the first to fortify. So there's the British ship. There's the Volante that got stranded at the mouth of Mobile Bay. They go up, take all the ships, all their men up into Mobile Bay. They land at Dog River. If you're familiar with Mobile, it's 7 or 8 miles south of downtown. And they land all their supplies there, and they push, pull, and drag through the swamps, these enormous guns. It's a slow process, and the British know they're coming. It's not a surprise at all. Everybody knows there's ships in the bay, there's Spanish soldiers coming, but they only have what you see on the screen to defend the entire town. They've got this really small force hemmed up inside Fort Charlotte. And there it is sitting on the screen. And to slow down the British, what they had begun to do is actually burn part of the town so that they create a field of fire. So the Spanish can't hide behind these buildings. And Galvez took exception to that. So when the Spanish finally arrived, began the siege, they send these emissaries to negotiate. Spain sends somebody over to talk with the commander at Elias Durnford at Fort Charlotte. Galvez has many times more men, and everybody knows he's more well armed. He's prepared for a siege, and he says, "Why don't we just avoid this? Go ahead and surrender. You have no chance. You're surrounded." And Durnford, of course, says, defiantly, "Our forces are much beyond your excellency's conception. We're prepared to fight." And he makes this dramatic moment where he takes all of his men, these few 150 men. He says, "Look, the Spanish have us outnumbered 10-1. They're surrounding us. They've got better armament. We've got no way out. I can understand if some of you aren't up to the fight, you're welcome to go. But for all those who are brave and want to make a fight, we're here." And so naturally, no one's going to leave. They all cheer and stand and stay. And so they're going to try to make a stand. And then they get into this really weird little 1700s little exchange of cordialities between the commanders. The Spanish, the British started. The British, to show how prepared they were and buy time for themselves, they're about to endure a siege, and supplies will be in short supply. And the first thing Durnford does is sort of surprises Galvez, sends him this gift of wine and bread and meats and cheeses, just basically saying, "I've got all I need, you bring it on." And so Galvez, not to be outdone, he next sends the commander of Fort Charlotte these boxes and crates of oranges and cigars. So they're sitting here exchanging all this while a siege is getting ready to be underway. And the whole point was that the British were hoping a relief force from here, from Pensacola, would have time to come. So they're trying to buy time with all this blustering. So the Spanish finally get their guns into position, and on the north of the screen, you'll see that's where the position was. If you know anything about Mobile at all, you know where the Mardi Gras Museum is or the Civic Center was. We just tore it down. That's roughly where that fortification was. So it's a distance of maybe half a mile. And they set up their guns, and there's some big guns. So there's a map. I forgot I had a map there. That's roughly where those fortifications were in Mobile. They've got these big guns. They get everything to position, and then they open fire. And they do it just as this column from Pensacola is trying to get over there to help out in Mobile. It's not a very big one, but it's a few hundred guys. And the first shot of the battle is fired around 10 a.m. By the end of the day, the white flag's up. They are blowing holes through the wall of Fort Charlotte that they say are big enough for a man and a horse to walk through by the end of the day. So it doesn't last very long. And that force that's coming to relieve them gets just close enough to hear all this, and they hear the guns stop, and they get closer, and they see the white flag. They see actually the Spanish flag. So day late and a dollar short. It's not a huge battle in terms of, it's not like Gettysburg or anything. You got one guy that was killed on each side, and the poor Spaniard wasn't even killed by gunfire. He was chopping down a tree to make way for an artillery battery, and the thing went the wrong way and got him. So it's anyway. But the significance of the battle is not numbers of men. It's that now Galvez has captured 2/3 of the colony, and Great Britain is on their heels, and it's very obvious that Pensacola is going to be the next target. And so Galvez pauses. He goes back to New Orleans, resupplies for this final campaign. Everybody knows is coming is Pensacola. It's the only point that's still left under British control in the colony. And what he does, though, is he leaves a little outpost on the eastern shore of Mobile Bay, basically where Old Town Daphne is, roughly, about 180, 190 guys. And he said that you're just going to watch the British in Pensacola, and then I'm going to resupply, and I'm going to come back, and we're all going to go capture Pensacola. So he does that, and the British realize that little isolated outpost is their one, best, and last chance to turn the course of this war, which had gone entirely against them at every step. They said, we can capture this little outpost. We'll be able to capture Mobile again. We'll slow down Galvez. And so they started this effort to make a surprise attack on this place. And so in January of 1781, they send ships into Mobile Bay to prevent any Spanish troops from coming to supply the place. They send an army from Pensacola, the Pensacola Road, as they called it, to go over to the eastern shore. And at a foggy morning, just at dawn, they descend on this little outpost, and they attack it. I pulled this. It's a copyrighted image you can see there, but I pulled it off the internet, and you're looking at Highway 98 in Daphne, and you're looking basically in the general vicinity of where this was from south of I-10. So it's a well-organized attack. They catch the Spanish almost completely off guard. A lot of them are outside this little outpost. They almost overwhelm them. And the key word is almost, because the Spanish, just enough Spaniards managed to make it inside the fort and begin to operate their artillery that they slowed this British attack down. And in the words of one of them, he said, we determined that rather than running, we would sell our lives dearly. They said, we're going to stay and fight. And they did so. And you got this really pitched battle that happens for about 20 or 30 minutes. One guy, a little bit of exaggeration maybe, he said it was Bunker's Hill in miniature. So a pretty significant fight on the eastern shore of Mobile Bay. So most of the guys attacking it, most of the British were actually mercenary German troops, Waldeckers. And so when their commanders were picked off, you suddenly have guys in command who weren't able to communicate orders very well with German-speaking troops. And so you've got a little bit of disorder. The Spanish are behind the wall. They're not. And by the end of the day, they realized that their best chance is gone. We're not going to take this place, give up the fight, go back to Pensacola. And that's what they did. But you see with the casualty figures, it's a pretty significant battle as far as Revolutionary War numbers go. 40 guys on each side doesn't sound huge, but it's definitely the largest battle of this campaign. And we will be reenacting that battle at Blakeley, historic Blakeley, next weekend. First time anybody's ever done that. So we're going to try to start that tradition. It happened just 5 or 6 miles from us. So we've got some guys from all over the Gulf Coast coming to help us do that, portray the folks who were there. So just FYI, if you're interested in learning about that, look on our website. So Galvez is already on the way by all the time this happens. He picks up those guys at the village, they move on, and they're going to make their way right here to the final campaign, the final part of this effort to capture West Florida, and they're going to make their way into Pensacola Bay. Galvez commanded the army and 3 or 4 ships from the colony of Louisiana, and he was going to cooperate with the Spanish fleet. Those 2 forces combined operation was going to be able to make this happen. Well, there was some conflict as soon as that Galvez got into the bay or got to the bay. And this is a view from the lighthouse in Pensacola looking towards the entrance of Pensacola Bay. They arrive and make a long story short that probably a lot of you are probably familiar with. The commander of the Spanish fleet saw what they were up against, and Galvez wanted him to go in immediately. And he said, I'm not going to take my fleet in here. I don't know the depth of the water. I don't know where the guns are, etc. He said, I'm not going to risk a humiliating defeat until I know more about it. So we need to stop and scout it. Galvez said, there's no time for that. And again, I'm summarizing a series of events here, but he took those 3 ships that he was in command of and said, if you won't go in, if the fleet is too scared to go in, I'll take my little bitty homemade ships and colony, and we'll go in, do it ourselves. And so he goes into the bay, and a hail of gunfire meets him from all sides of the bay, but none of his ships are sunk. He anchors out in the bay. All the troops on both sides see this, and he's cheered. It's a big triumphal moment. And after the campaign, Galvez actually has put on his coat of arms a new panel for that moment. If you can see up there, this is actually the panel that's put up there. There's this one ship, and there's one guy on the back, then go forward, and right above it is a little banner that says, Yo Solo, I alone. That's where that came from, is him entering the bay. So once he gets into the bay, sort of shames the Spanish Navy to come in behind him, and the siege for Pensacola begins in earnest. Begins in March. It's going to go all the way through May 1781. It's going to combine, as you see on the screen, a pretty diverse force. The Spanish have quite a large advantage in numbers of men overall. By the end of the siege, they're going to have roughly 7,000 soldiers and sailors because the French fleet's going to join them. By the end of the siege, the British here defending these multiple posts in Pensacola, they start out with roughly 1,500 men, a lot of Indians. And as this siege progresses, and it's a traditional European style siege, these Indian allies decide that really wasn't the war they signed up for. They start leaving. So the British forces are start to shrink as the siege goes on, and the Spanish forces and their allies are growing. So it's clearly that the Spanish have an advantage of this. And everybody probably knows it's not one fortification I'm talking about. It's several fortifications around the bay and around the town. And they're going to just basically get progressively closer. I'm not going to read through every day of the events, but basically the Spanish arrive. They capture a little position off of Santa Rosa Island. They make their way into what we now know as the town of Pensacola. And throughout the weeks, there's a steady progression of them getting closer and closer to these fortifications. And it all culminates with this one shot on May 8th, 1781. As they're point blank range, they're firing mortars. And the mortars, they go up and they come straight down. And one of these mortar shots makes its way right into the open door of a powder magazine of the British fortification. And boom. And there's probably about 100 guys that are killed. 2 or 3 walls of this fortification. One of those fortifications are gone. That's the Queen's Redoubt, which you see. So just go up Palafox Street, Fort George, that area. and they compelled the surrender of the remaining Spanish garrison. And of course, you know that Pensacola was surrendered to Galvez, and everybody's probably seen this lovely statue of him down on Palafox. And around the base of that statue, you know, there's little short descriptions of these battles I just told you about. This was the culminating event in that campaign. So when he captured Pensacola, he had basically captured every military outpost in British West Florida. So West Florida, instead of British West Florida, was by default now Spanish West Florida. So that's how the change of possession occurred. Now, there's one little wrinkle that's left. It's a little funny one. Over in Natchez, remember, Natchez had been surrendered by the guy at Baton Rouge, even though there were no Spanish troops there. So the British at the link said, you know, there's nobody else around here. Why don't we just take this thing back? And they attempted to do that. And they tricked the Spaniards there. They said they were digging a tunnel under the fort. They put up scarecrows at the edge of the wood, a few hundred yards away, to look like a force, an armed force that was getting ready. And they gave up. They surrendered it. And then Galvez heard about it and said, well, wait, we've just captured all of this. We're gonna restore our ownership. So he sends a force up there, and this group of people who had captured this fortification were scared to death he was going to kill them all. So they began this long trek going through the wilderness of what's now Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, scared to death that there's going to be Spanish troops to kill them at every step. And weeks later, after all this happened, they wash up at Savannah and realize that the whole thing was over. So when Galvez captures West Florida, it became Spanish West Florida, but the Revolutionary War was still going on. You know, Yorktown isn't until October of 1781. We're talking about May. So when the war ended and the Treaty of Paris was signed, the United States recognized its southern border as being Spanish West Florida's border. The problem was they wanted to recognize it at the 31st parallel. We talked about this. The British had moved it up. So for a few years, there was a fight about where that border actually was. Spain was on the decline as a world power, and ultimately was prevailed upon to move the border south. So they had posts in that disputed area. That's the area that you see, the little rectangle there at the bottom. That they actually moved down. They had posts up near Montgomery and other places, but they were compelled to move it, give it away to the United States, move back below the 31st parallel where they would maintain a colony, and the United States immediately annexed that area into a new territory called Mississippi Territory. And so you start with that step. You start the process by which all of this area will become part of the United States. So step by step between 1798 and to 1819, you get this area that was formerly part of this British colony annexed into the new states of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and ultimately Florida. All happens within a decade or two after that. So that is a relatively quick overview of a lot of history, focusing on the colony of West Florida and its role in the American Revolution. Be glad to answer any questions at all that I can. As Kelly introduced me, I do have books. I've got the 14th Colony book that this is based on, and a few others I've written about regional history. If you're interested, I'd be glad to talk with you about that afterwards. But I appreciate your attention today. Is there anything I can clarify or answer or anything at all? All right, you are ready to go teach about 14th Colony. All right, thank you very much.